The sun had just begun its slow climb over the quiet suburban streets. The soft orange light touched the tops of the trees and made the neat rows of houses glow in a warm, comforting way. Birds chirped in the early morning, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the scent of freshly mown grass. It was the kind of morning that made anyone feel at peace, as though the world had paused for just a little while. In one of these houses lived a man who had seen far more of life than most. At 74, he carried himself with a calm strength that came from decades of experience. His hair was silver now, and his hands bore the marks of hard work and service, but his eyes still held the sharpness of someone who had faced real challenges and come through them. He had spent his life serving his country, first in the military and later in law enforcement, and the values he learned in those years had stayed with him. Discipline, patience, and respect for others were not just words to him. They were the way he lived every day. He had chosen this neighborhood for its quiet charm. It was peaceful here, with tree-lined streets and neighbors who mostly minded their own business. Life was simple but good. Every morning he followed the same routine. He would start his day with a cup of strong coffee, brewed just the way he liked it, sitting on the porch while the sun warmed his face. He liked to watch the neighborhood wake up, the mail carrier making her rounds, a few joggers passing by, kids on their way to school. It was a world that felt predictable, safe, and comfortable. After breakfast, he would tend to his small garden. Gardening had become a kind of therapy for him over the years. Planting flowers, trimming bushes, and checking on the vegetable patch gave him a sense of control and satisfaction. It was a place where he could think, remember, and simply be. He took pride in the little things: a row of perfectly planted tomatoes, the bloom of a new rose, the careful pruning of a bonsai tree he had nurtured for decades. It reminded him that life, like a garden, needed attention, patience, and care to thrive. Though he was largely peaceful and reserved, he had not forgotten how to stand up for himself. Over the years, he had seen the importance of understanding rules, knowing rights, and respecting authority, and he expected the same from others. While many of his neighbors had occasionally grumbled about the homeowners association, he had mostly stayed out of their disputes. He knew they had power, but he also knew their limitations. He had learned the hard way that some people tried to enforce rules without understanding the law, and he had no interest in unnecessary conflict. Life was better when everyone respected boundaries. Despite his calm demeanor, he had a keen awareness of the world around him. He noticed small details that others overlooked. A suspicious vehicle parked too long on the street, a stranger walking through the neighborhood without explanation, or even subtle changes in a neighbor's behavior. He could sense when something wasn't quite right. Years of training and experience had sharpened his instincts. It wasn't paranoia, it was caution. He trusted his judgment, and it had served him well over the years. On this particular morning, everything seemed ordinary. The air was crisp, the sun bright, and the neighborhood quiet. He was sipping his coffee, watching the gentle sway of a tree in his yard, when he noticed a car slowly cruising past the house. At first, he paid it little attention. Cars came and went all the time, and it could have been a delivery driver or a neighbor. But something about the way this car moved didn't sit right with him. It wasn't the speed or the make, it was the hesitation, the way the driver seemed to be watching him more than the road. He set down his cup and squinted, trying to get a better look. The car slowed to a stop just past his driveway. Two men inside were looking directly at the house. They weren't in uniform, but there was a certain confidence in the way they carried themselves, a sense of authority that seemed out of place for a quiet neighborhood morning. The veteran's mind went into alert mode. He didn't panic, but he noted every detail: the car's color, the shape of the license plate, the way the men moved. Years of experience had taught him that appearances could be deceptive, and he always preferred to be prepared. He returned to his coffee, but kept one eye on the car. After a few minutes, the men got out. That's when he noticed the small badges clipped to their belts. They looked official, but something about them didn't feel right. The badges were generic, lacking the insignia and identification numbers of true law enforcement. The men approached the front door, walking with purpose, knocking firmly and calling out in authoritative tones. The veteran took a deep breath. He had encountered authority before, and he knew the difference between genuine law enforcement and imposters. Something about these men triggered a warning signal he couldn't ignore. He rose from his chair slowly, moving toward the door in a way that showed confidence but not aggression. He wasn't intimidated, but he was ready. He opened a small peephole and observed the men carefully. Their faces were unfamiliar, their movements precise but slightly off. Their voices were firm, almost rehearsed. They were trying to project control, but their lack of authenticity was evident to someone who had spent a lifetime recognizing it. The veteran stepped back from the door and considered his options. He could call the police immediately, but he wanted to assess the situation first. He wasn't about to open the door to strangers claiming authority without proof. The men continued to knock and shout, demanding entry and referencing supposed violations of HOA rules. The accusations were vague, contradictory, and didn't match anything he had ever heard from the homeowners association. It was clear they were attempting to intimidate him, to provoke a reaction. As he stood there, he thought back to his years of service. He had faced real threats, dangerous situations where hesitation could cost lives. He had learned to remain calm, analyze the circumstances, and act with precision. Fear had no place in decision-making. The same principles applied here. He wasn't dealing with a military threat or a criminal gang, but the mindset was the same: observe, assess, and respond wisely. While the men continued their loud demands, he reached for something he had kept nearby, a badge that represented more than authority. It was a reminder of his commitment to law, duty, and justice. He didn't use it lightly, but he knew that when the time came it would command respect and clarity. For now, though, he remained patient, waiting for the right moment to assert his position. Inside the house, the veteran's mind was methodical. He reviewed the sequence of events, preparing mentally for all possibilities. The men outside were trying to push him into action, to make him react in fear or anger. He refused to give them that satisfaction. His movements were deliberate, measured, calm. He checked the doors and windows, ensuring everything was secure, and he prepared to communicate clearly if the situation escalated. Meanwhile, the neighborhood seemed unaware of the tension building at this particular house. Birds still chirped, a dog barked in the distance, and the sun continued its slow climb. It was a stark contrast to the storm of uncertainty unfolding at the veteran's doorstep. He found a strange kind of clarity in the quiet. While others might have panicked or overreacted, he felt focused, ready to respond appropriately without causing unnecessary conflict. The men outside were unaware of what they were dealing with. They had likely chosen this house because it seemed like any other, someone who would follow HOA rules without question. They didn't know that the man inside had a lifetime of experience dealing with threats, authority, and intimidation. They underestimated him, assuming that fear could force compliance. That assumption would soon prove to be a critical mistake. As the minutes passed, the veteran kept observing, learning, and preparing. He noted every gesture, every word, every small detail about the imposters. He could tell their confidence was masking uncertainty. They were trying to appear in control, but their lack of knowledge about the law and their inability to identify themselves properly revealed the truth. He felt a mixture of patience and quiet determination. He had faced bigger challenges in life, and he would handle this one with the same calm precision. Though the situation was tense, he also felt a certain satisfaction in knowing that he could protect himself. He had spent years training, learning, and serving, and those experiences were not wasted. This was a reminder that wisdom, patience, and confidence were as powerful as any weapon. He understood the importance of staying grounded, of using knowledge over fear, and of maintaining control in moments of uncertainty. The sun climbed higher, casting stronger light on the house. Shadows shifted across the yard, and the men outside continued their efforts, unaware that their presence was being carefully monitored and assessed. The veteran prepared himself mentally for the confrontation that was inevitable. He didn't rush, didn't panic, and didn't react emotionally. Every movement, every decision would be deliberate. He was ready for what was coming next, confident that he could handle the situation while remaining safe and in control. In the quiet moments before the storm, he reflected on the life he had led, the discipline, the service, the lessons learned through hard experience. These were the moments that defined him, the foundation that gave him the courage to stand firm. The morning felt heavy with anticipation, but he was calm. He knew the morning had already stretched into late hours when the veteran realized the situation at his doorstep was far from ordinary. The men outside had stopped walking casually. Now their presence carried a tense authority that demanded attention. They knocked louder, their voices firmer, each syllable laced with the assumption that fear could force compliance. They claimed they were enforcing rules, referencing the homeowners association and citing supposed violations. But their statements were vague, inconsistent, and lacked any proper documentation. From his vantage point behind the door, the veteran observed them closely. He had seen people pretend to have power before, but his experience in both the military and law enforcement allowed him to recognize subtle tells that revealed a lie. Their movements were stiff, rehearsed. They seemed uncomfortable when he didn't immediately comply. Their badges looked real at first glance, but the details were off. The engraving was imprecise. The logos were generic, and there were no identification numbers that matched any official record. It was all show, a performance meant to intimidate, but they underestimated the man behind the door. He moved calmly through his house, making sure he was in a position to respond safely. He kept his body relaxed but alert. His mind worked quickly, cataloging every detail. The number of people, their physical appearance, the make and color of the vehicle parked outside, even their footwear and the angle at which they approached the door, all of it mattered. Every observation was a piece of a puzzle that would help him stay safe and act wisely. He knew that haste or fear could lead to mistakes, and mistakes could be dangerous. The men outside were growing more impatient. Their voices carried over the quiet street, demanding to know why he hadn't answered. They threatened fines and consequences from the HOA, hoping that the weight of bureaucracy and fear would force him to open the door. They didn't know, and perhaps never considered, that the man inside had spent a lifetime facing real threats, and this was nothing compared to what he had endured. The veteran took a slow breath and reminded himself to remain calm. Calmness, he knew, was more powerful than anger or fear. It allowed him to think clearly, make smart decisions, and maintain control over a situation that others might see as chaotic. He didn't shout, he didn't yell, and he didn't make sudden movements. Instead, he focused on assessing the next steps. First, he needed to establish that he understood who they were and their intentions. Then he could decide how to respond without escalating unnecessarily. He leaned slightly closer to the peephole, studying their faces. Their expressions were confident but forced. They spoke loudly, trying to project authority, but their eyes betrayed uncertainty. This was the first confirmation he needed. They were bluffing. He had dealt with this kind of deception before, people trying to use appearances to manipulate or intimidate. He knew how to handle it, and he did so with patience. The men started to argue among themselves. He could hear snippets of their conversation, quiet at first but growing louder as their frustration mounted. One of them asked the other why the man wasn't answering, while the second insisted they were following orders and enforcing HOA rules. Their coordination was weak. They hadn't practiced beyond the initial performance. Their lack of preparation was evident, and it gave the veteran confidence. He had the upper hand without having to confront them physically. He decided to speak. Not loudly, not aggressively, but firmly enough for them to hear. "I am listening," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Please state your purpose clearly and show me your identification." There was a pause outside, a momentary silence as they processed his response. It was the first time he had spoken, and it disrupted their flow. Their confidence wavered slightly. They were used to people reacting with fear or compliance, but this man was neither fearful nor intimidated. He was calm, measured, and in control. That realization began to unsettle them. One of the men held up a badge, attempting to reinforce the idea that they were legitimate authority figures. It glinted in the morning sun, but the veteran noticed immediately that it was not genuine. He could see the imperfections, the cheap metal, the lack of official insignia. It was intended to intimidate, but to him it only confirmed his suspicions. These men were not real officers. They were imposters, and they were relying on fear to gain compliance. He continued to speak in a calm but firm tone. "I will not open the door without proper identification and documentation. I am aware of my rights, and I expect you to follow the law." His words had an effect. The men looked at each other, uncertainty flickering across their faces. They had not anticipated resistance, and certainly not resistance backed by knowledge and authority. They tried to regain composure, but their attempts were clumsy. They were not trained for confrontation with someone who could see through their act. The veteran remained composed, watching their every move. He could feel the tension growing, a quiet pressure building just outside the door. He knew that the longer the standoff continued, the more dangerous it could become. But he also knew that fear or rash action could create unnecessary risk. His training taught him patience, observation, and strategic action. He was waiting for the right moment to establish control, and that moment would come when he could assert his authority clearly and safely. Inside the house, he checked his surroundings. Everything was in order. Doors were locked, windows were secure, and he had easy access to communication devices if needed. He was not alone in awareness either. Neighbors occasionally glanced out their windows, curious about the unusual scene. Some muttered among themselves, unsure of what was happening. Yet the veteran focused entirely on the men at his door. He had a plan, and he intended to see it through with composure and intelligence. Time seemed to stretch. The men outside continued their attempts, now more forceful but still ineffective. They did not realize that they were dealing with someone whose life experience included strategy, negotiation, and conflict resolution under far more severe circumstances. Every word, every gesture, and every piece of evidence they presented was being carefully evaluated. The veteran's calm presence contrasted sharply with their growing agitation. He decided to take the next step, subtly asserting his readiness without opening the door. From a secure position, he retrieved a document that verified his status and authority. It was not necessary yet, but it was a reminder to himself that he was prepared. He placed it in view of the peephole so that if the men tried to escalate, he could show them immediately that he was not an easy target. Their frustration was becoming more visible. One of them muttered under his breath, likely expecting the man inside to falter. Another tapped the door impatiently, still trying to intimidate. The veteran remained calm, each movement deliberate. He could see the cracks forming in their facade. Their confidence was fading because they had overestimated their own authority and underestimated his experience. He spoke again, his voice calm but authoritative. "I will cooperate fully once proper identification and legal documentation are presented. Until then, I will not respond to threats or intimidation." The words seemed to shake them. The imposters were used to compliance, not calm defiance. They began to hesitate, unsure of their next move. Their entire plan relied on the assumption that fear could force him to act against his own judgment. That assumption had failed. The veteran's observation skills were sharper than ever. He noted small details. The way one of the men adjusted his badge nervously, the slight twitch in the other's eye, the way they glanced at their vehicle as if considering retreat. He remained calm, aware, and prepared for any escalation, but he also recognized that the imbalance of power was already shifting. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not from confrontation, but from preparedness. Years of service had taught him that confidence, knowledge, and patience were far more effective than aggression. He did not need to shout, fight, or panic. He only needed to remain calm, observe, and act strategically. Then he made a decision. He would not allow the situation to drag on indefinitely. He needed to assert his authority in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. He prepared to present proof of his official status, a symbol that would immediately communicate that he was not just a homeowner, but a trained law enforcement officer. It was a measure he had hoped not to need, but it was the right time to show it. As he moved to retrieve it, he kept one eye on the men outside, noting every movement. Their postures had changed. They were uncertain, hesitant, and slightly defensive. They had expected compliance and fear, but what they got was calm observation, careful strategy, and quiet confidence. They did not yet know that they were about to be confronted with a level of authority they had never anticipated. For a brief moment, the veteran allowed himself to reflect on the contrast between his calm interior and the chaos outside. It was a reminder of life's lessons. Preparation and patience often win over intimidation and bluster. Experience could turn fear into clarity, and knowledge could neutralize threats without a single unnecessary risk. He held the badge firmly in his hand, ready to present it at the right moment. He knew the effect it would have. The men outside had no idea of the man behind the door. They assumed he was like any other neighbor, unprepared for confrontation, willing to... The tension outside the door had reached a level that made the air feel thick. Every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of shoes on the pavement, the faint creak of the car door, even the distant bark of a dog felt sharper. The veteran stood quietly inside, his hand on the badge he had retrieved. It was more than a piece of metal. To him, it symbolized decades of service, training, and authority earned through experience and sacrifice. He knew exactly what it could accomplish when revealed at the right moment. The men outside continued to pound on the door, their voices rising. They repeated their demands, their words jagged and rushed. "Open up, you're breaking HOA rules. We need to see identification now." Their tone was meant to intimidate, to make anyone without confidence or knowledge of the law react impulsively. But the veteran remained unmoved. Years of facing danger, of assessing threats, had taught him that composure was the strongest defense. Fear could cloud judgment. Calm could make the difference between control and chaos. From behind the door, he studied them carefully. They were two men, roughly the same age, dressed in dark clothing with badges clipped to their belts. Their movements were stiff, their gestures overdone in an attempt to appear confident. He could see the way they glanced at each other, communicating through subtle nods and shifting eyes. They were rehearsing a performance they hadn't fully prepared for, and it was beginning to falter. The veteran recognized the signs of uncertainty. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but to someone trained in reading body language, it was obvious. He took a step back and breathed slowly. Calmness allowed him to think, to anticipate, and to plan his next action. There was no need to rush. Every second they spent trying to intimidate him gave him more information, more clarity about who they were and what they intended. He could see their nervousness growing as he remained silent and observant. Their plan relied on fear and surprise. That plan was failing. The knocking intensified, accompanied now by loud, demanding voices. One of them leaned against the door, speaking with a tone that tried to mask frustration with authority. "You don't want trouble, sir. Just comply with the rules." But even as he said it, his voice wavered slightly. The veteran noticed this immediately. He wasn't about to escalate verbally or physically. Instead, he continued to prepare mentally, readying the moment to assert true authority. From a safe distance, he could see through the peephole that their posture had changed. The man who had seemed most confident now shifted his weight nervously, a small sign that he was aware the situation was not going as expected. The other man fidgeted with his badge, twisting it in a way that made it glint in the sunlight, perhaps hoping the visual would intimidate. The veteran noted every detail. Nothing about their act could hide the truth. These were imposters relying on bravado and appearance. He made the decision. It was time to confront them, not aggressively, but with clarity and authority that left no room for doubt. Slowly, he opened the door just enough to show himself, keeping a safe position that allowed him to retreat if needed. The sunlight fell across his face, illuminating his calm expression. His eyes met theirs directly, steady and unwavering. There was no fear, no hesitation, only the confidence of a man who had lived through challenges far greater than this. The men froze. Their rehearsed confidence faltered under his gaze. He lifted the badge, holding it where they could see clearly. The metallic glint caught their attention immediately. This was not a prop. It was real, a symbol of genuine authority and law. Their demeanor changed instantly. Where there had been arrogance and attempts at intimidation, now there was hesitation and uncertainty. "The balance of power had shifted, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and firm. "I am a United States Marshal. You are on private property without authorization, and you are impersonating law enforcement. Step back immediately." The words landed heavily. For the first time, the men were silent, processing the situation. They had assumed they could intimidate him, that fear could force compliance. They had not anticipated authority, knowledge and experience presented calmly and decisively. Their faces showed the first real signs of panic. The veteran continued to watch them closely, his body relaxed but ready to respond if necessary. One of them stammered, trying to regain composure. "We are just enforcing HOA rules. You can't just—" The veteran held up a hand. "You are not authorized to enforce any law. HOA rules do not grant law enforcement powers. You are trespassing and your badges are fraudulent. Step away now or I will call the police immediately." He kept his tone calm, steady and unwavering. There was no anger, no yelling. Just clarity, authority, and certainty. He knew that his demeanor was crucial. Imposters often rely on fear, and any sign of hesitation or aggression could have escalated the situation. By remaining composed, he controlled the environment without ever needing to raise his voice. The men exchanged glances, their confidence crumbling further. One of them muttered something to the other, clearly debating whether to retreat or continue. Their eyes darted toward the street, then to the house, assessing options, but there was no easy escape from the reality they faced. They had misjudged the man in front of them, and now the consequences were apparent. He continued speaking, his words deliberate. "You have two options. Leave now and face no further action, or remain and face the consequences of impersonating law enforcement. I will involve the authorities if you do not leave immediately." The effect was immediate. Their postures stiffened as uncertainty turned into panic. They had relied on projection of authority, but the reality of the situation was undeniable. Their bluff had been called, and there was no room to maneuver. The veteran observed their hesitation, noting every subtle movement. His training and experience allowed him to anticipate their next steps. One of the men slowly stepped back and the other followed, both clearly recognizing that they were outmatched. The veteran maintained his position, not advancing, not retreating, simply standing with calm authority. It was a clear message he was in control, and they were on his property without legitimate cause. The street remained quiet, save for the occasional sound of a neighbor peeking through a window or a car passing in the distance. The contrast between the serenity of the neighborhood and the tension at the veteran's doorstep was striking. He felt a sense of clarity and control that came from preparation, knowledge, and experience. He was not acting out of anger, but out of the necessity to protect himself and assert the truth. The men began to move toward their vehicle, clearly deciding that retreat was the safest option. One of them looked back at the veteran, hesitation and fear evident in his eyes. The other fumbled with the car door, trying to start it quickly as if speed could erase the mistake they had made. But the veteran remained calm. He observed every movement, noting the license plate and the model of the car. These details would be important if authorities needed evidence. As they drove away, the tension finally began to lift. The veteran exhaled slowly, feeling the release of hours of mental vigilance. He did not smile, did not celebrate, but he allowed himself a quiet sense of satisfaction. The situation had been handled without violence, without escalation, and without compromise to his safety. His training, experience, and calm demeanor had turned what could have been a frightening encounter into a controlled resolution. He stepped back inside, closing the door fully and locking it. The sound of the lock clicked in a way that was both reassuring and final. The imposters were gone, their bluff exposed, their authority nullified by truth and experience. He could finally breathe normally, his mind shifting from vigilance to reflection. He took a seat near the window, watching the street return to its usual quiet. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, some whispering about the incident they had glimpsed from a distance. A few came closer, cautiously approaching to ask if he was okay. He greeted them calmly, acknowledging their concern but keeping the focus on the facts. He explained that everything was under control, that the men had been imposters, and that no one was harmed. The neighborhood's atmosphere shifted slightly, the story of the morning's confrontation spreading quietly among the houses. People began to realize that the veteran was not someone to be underestimated, that experience, knowledge, and calm confidence could prevent intimidation without conflict. His presence was a reminder that courage and preparedness were powerful tools, sometimes more powerful than physical force or aggression. Inside the house, he reflected on the events. There was a sense of quiet triumph, not from confrontation itself, but from handling the situation with intelligence and composure. The badge he had held, the calm tone of his voice, and the careful observation of every detail had been enough to expose the imposters and protect his home. It was a reminder that preparation and awareness could turn potential danger into a controlled resolution. He also thought about the broader lesson, the importance of standing firm in the face of intimidation. Many people would have opened the door out of fear or complied with vague threats. He had not. He had relied on knowledge, training, and calm judgment. That combination had made all the difference. It was not about pride. It was about safety, clarity, and ensuring that the truth prevailed. The morning continued, the sunlight growing brighter. The imposter's car disappeared down the street, leaving only the sound of tires crunching on gravel and the faint echo of their hurried departure. The veteran remained still for a moment, taking in the silence. It was a silence that felt almost sacred after the tension of the morning, a quiet that allowed him to collect his thoughts and reflect on what had just happened. Though his home was now safe, he knew the situation was far from over. The men had come with an intent to intimidate, and even though they had left, there were steps he needed to take to ensure accountability and prevent further threats. He walked slowly back inside, closing and locking the door behind him. Every lock clicked with a sense of finality, a small but satisfying reassurance that his property was secure. He moved to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee, taking a slow sip while he began to think through the next actions. Even in moments of victory, he understood the importance of thoroughness. Experience had taught him that threats rarely end completely when they appear to vanish. Preparation, documentation, and communication were essential to maintain safety and resolve the situation properly. The first thing he did was document everything. He went to his desk and began writing down every detail he could remember. The car they arrived in, the make, model, and color, the badges they wore, the words they spoke, the way they moved, even their body language. He recorded the time, the sequence of events, and his observations about their attempts to intimidate him. He knew that in situations like these, careful records could make all the difference if authorities needed to intervene. Documentation was not just a precaution, it was a form of control over the narrative, ensuring that facts were clear and verifiable. Once he had written down the events in detail, he took photographs of the area outside his home. Even though the men had left, the environment still held clues, footprints, tire marks, and subtle signs of their presence. Every detail mattered. He had learned that thorough observation and evidence collection could prevent speculation, exaggeration, or misrepresentation. By gathering clear, objective evidence, he ensured that his side of the story would be credible and authoritative. Next, he contacted the local police. He calmly explained the situation, detailing the presence of the imposters, their false badges, and their attempt to intimidate him under the guise of HOA authority. He provided all the information he had documented, including descriptions, photographs, and the license plate of their vehicle. The police listened attentively, recognizing the seriousness of impersonating law enforcement. They assured him that an investigation would be opened and that they would follow up on the report. While on the phone, he also notified the homeowners association. He described the incident clearly and factually, emphasizing that these men were not acting on behalf of the HOA and that their actions were illegal and dangerous. He requested that the HOA take steps to clarify their policies to prevent anyone from attempting similar intimidation in the future. By involving both law enforcement and the HOA, he ensured that all responsible parties were aware and that the situation was addressed from multiple angles. After making the calls, he took a moment to sit in the quiet of his living room. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was beginning to subside, leaving a sense of calm satisfaction. He thought about how quickly the situation had escalated and how close it could have come to being dangerous if he had reacted without patience or awareness. He felt a renewed appreciation for the value of calm, deliberate action in moments of uncertainty. It wasn't just about courage, it was about knowledge, preparation, and self-control. Neighbors began to peek from behind curtains and over fences, curious about the commotion. Some approached cautiously, asking if he was all right. He reassured them calmly, explaining that the situation had been resolved and that no one was harmed. The neighbors listened intently, impressed by the composure and preparedness he had displayed. There was a quiet sense of respect forming, a recognition that this man was not only experienced but capable of handling challenges with intelligence and calm authority. The veteran also considered the broader implications. He knew that the imposters had targeted him because they assumed he would be an easy mark, someone who could be intimidated or coerced into compliance. Their mistake had been underestimating his experience and awareness. He reflected on how often people assume others are vulnerable or uninformed, and how that assumption can be dangerous. By standing firm, documenting everything, and involving the proper authorities, he had turned the situation around entirely. He spent part of the afternoon checking his home and property for any overlooked details. Every lock, window, and door was inspected. Cameras and security systems were reviewed to ensure proper function. He wanted to be certain that no vulnerabilities remained. This was not paranoia. It was careful, responsible action. Experience had taught him that even minor oversights could lead to problems later. Prevention was as important as confrontation. Later, he drafted a summary of the incident for his neighbors. He didn't want to alarm anyone. but he felt it was important to share information so others could be aware and prepared. The note was factual, clear, and concise, detailing the presence of imposters, their methods, and the steps he had taken to ensure safety. He emphasized the importance of calmness, observation, and knowledge of rights. It was not a story of fear, but a lesson in preparedness and vigilance. By evening, the neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm. Children played quietly, cars drove past without incident, and the street regained its sense of normalcy. Yet the events of the morning left a lasting impression. People had witnessed a quiet act of courage and intelligence, and it became clear that true authority is not always loud or aggressive. It can be calm, measured, and informed. The veteran spent the evening in reflection. He thought about the importance of preparation in all aspects of life. The imposters had relied on fear, but he had relied on knowledge, experience, and patience. The situation had tested his ability to remain calm under pressure, to assess a threat accurately, and to act strategically. He realized that these lessons were valuable not only for him, but for the community around him. Awareness, caution, and preparedness could prevent escalation in many situations, not just encounters with imposters. He also considered how the experience had strengthened his sense of responsibility. Being a part of a community meant not only looking after oneself, but also being aware of potential risks that could affect neighbors. By documenting the incident, involving authorities, and sharing information with those around him, he had contributed to the safety of the neighborhood as a whole. His actions had demonstrated that courage is not always about confrontation. It can be about foresight, preparation, and the willingness to act decisively when necessary. As night fell, he sat on his porch with a cup of tea, watching the fading light. The street was quiet, the air cool and calm. He felt a deep sense of peace knowing that he had handled the situation responsibly and effectively. He reflected on the fact that true strength often comes from patience and clarity, not from force or intimidation. The imposters had come with the intention to scare, but they had left exposed and powerless, and he had achieved that without conflict. He thought about how he could use this experience to help others. Sharing lessons about awareness, calmness, and preparedness could empower neighbors and friends to handle unexpected challenges. He resolved to continue observing, documenting, and educating when necessary, not out of fear but out of responsibility. Life in the neighborhood would continue, but now with a heightened sense of vigilance and respect for true authority. The veteran also allowed himself a quiet moment of gratitude. He appreciated his years of training, his experience in law enforcement, and the discipline he had cultivated over decades. These had equipped him to handle situations that could have been frightening or dangerous. He realized that life often places unexpected challenges in one's path, and preparation, knowledge, and calm confidence are the best tools for navigating them. He went inside to review his notes one last time for the day. Everything was recorded, organized, and ready to be shared with authorities if necessary. He had created a clear account of the morning's events, ensuring that facts could not be misinterpreted. It was not about pride, it was about responsibility and accountability. He understood that thorough documentation could prevent misunderstandings and protect both himself and the community. Before going to bed, he walked through his home one last time, checking locks and ensuring that everything was secure. The imposters were gone. The immediate threat had passed, but the sense of responsibility remained. Vigilance was not about living in fear. It was about taking proactive steps to protect oneself and others. He felt confident that he had done exactly that. As he lay in bed, he thought about the lessons the day had taught. Patience, calmness, preparedness, and observation were more powerful than fear, intimidation, or force. Knowledge and experience could turn a potentially dangerous situation into a controlled, safe outcome. He understood that his actions had not only protected himself, but had also served as an example for others in the neighborhood. Courage is often quiet, and true authority is demonstrated through action, not words.